On the slopes above Cape Town stands a community whose DNA carries the imprint of 3 continents, a genetic archive written by force, exile, and survival. To understand the Cape Malay community of Cape Town, you have to begin not with a homeland, but with a root. In 1652, the first Dutch settlers arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, when Jan van Riebeeck established a trading post and supply fort on the sea route between Europe and the East Indies. This was a way station, a stopping point on one of the most trafficked commercial passages on Earth. And into it, the Dutch began to import people. The earliest Cape Muslims were brought to the Cape between 1652 and 1834, not by choice, but as part of an involuntary migration of slaves, political prisoners, and convicts, gathered from Africa and Asia. Some were exiled from the East Indies, specifically because they resisted colonial rule. They arrived in chains, or under sentence, or as captives of empire. Yet from this brutal arithmetic of forced movement, a community would form. The question that hangs over their story is a simple one, but the answer is vast. Where, exactly, did these people come from? The records give one kind of answer, but so, remarkably, does their blood. Part 1. The Ledger of Origins. The historical record is unusually specific about the peoples who were brought to the Cape. A large majority were Muslims, captured and exiled from colonies such as Madagascar, India, Ceylon, and the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia. Others came from further still, the Philippines, Japan, Macau, Malacca, the West Indies, Brazil, and possibly New Guinea. Consider the geography of that list. It spans nearly half the globe, and the numbers survive in the ledgers of slavery itself. Of the Cape slave population, Cape-born slaves formed roughly 30%. Enslaved people from India made up around a quarter. The Indonesian archipelago accounted for nearly 17%, East Africa about 14%, and Madagascar just over 13%. This was not a single origin. It was a convergence, an entire hemisphere funneled into one small colonial port. Each percentage in that ledger was a human being, torn from a specific place, but a ledger only records who arrived. It cannot tell you what happened next, who married whom, who survived, whose lineage carried forward. For that deeper story, we need to look somewhere the paperwork could never reach, into the DNA of their descendants. Part 2. The Saint of Makassar. Before the genetics, one name stands at the heart of this history. Sheikh Yusuf al-Taj al-Khalwati al-Makassari is credited with bringing Islam to South Africa. He was born in 1626 in Goa, on the island of Celebes, today known as Sulawesi. He was of Makassarese nobility, a nephew of the King of Goa. He was not a slave in the ordinary sense. He was an exile, a man of standing and influence, whom the Dutch East India Company considered dangerous enough to remove to the very edge of their world. Sheikh Yusuf and his followers were settled at Zandvliet Farm, at the mouth of the Eerste River outside Cape Town, in an area that today still bears the name Macassar. He died there on the 23rd of May, 1699. His exile turned a place of banishment into a foundation stone. Around figures like him, a distinctly Cape Muslim faith and culture took root and endured. But Sheikh Yusuf's story raises a larger question about everyone who was brought here against their will. If the men came predominantly from Asia, from Macassar, from India, from the archipelago, then who were the mothers of this new community? The answer is where the science becomes extraordinary. Part 3. Written in the Blood. Here the story turns from archives to laboratories, and the findings are peer-reviewed and consistent. In a study of 100 unrelated Cape Muslim males, scientists examined 2 separate genetic inheritances. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son, showed an overwhelming predominance of Asian contribution, roughly 79%. That fits the ledger. The fathers came largely from Asia, but the mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, told a very different story. The maternal line was split almost evenly between Asian and African contributions, around 42 and 40%. In other words, the men who founded these families came predominantly from across the Indian Ocean, while a huge share of the founding mothers were African. This is what geneticists call sex-biased admixture, and the Cape community is one of the most striking examples in the world. The blood does not contradict the history, it completes it. And when researchers widen their lens beyond the Cape Muslim community to the broader population they belong to, the pattern grew even more remarkable. Part 4. 5 Rivers, 1 People. The Cape Malay community forms part of a larger group, the admixed South African colored population, the predominant group in the Western Cape. Genetic studies describe it as a complex, 5-way admixture. Its 5 source populations are the African San, African non-San, European, South Asian, and East Asian. 5 distinct human streams flowing into a single people, and within that mixture, one contribution stands out above all others. Analyses revealed extraordinarily unbalanced, gender-specific origins. The most striking was a massive maternal Khoisan contribution, more than 60%, alongside an almost negligible maternal European contribution, even as the European paternal contribution was substantial. Researchers concluded that the modern population resulted mainly from the early encounter, around 350 years ago, of European and African men with the autochthonous Khoisan women of the Cape of Good Hope. There was also a clear second maternal thread, about 16%, of South and Southeast Asian origin, identified through specific mitochondrial haplogroups. This is the deep truth beneath the Bo-Kaap, a people whose maternal heart is overwhelmingly indigenous to this land, joined to paternal lines that crossed oceans. But does that mixture look the same everywhere? It does not. Part 5. A map drawn in Ancestry. Genetics can do something history alone cannot. It can draw a map of ancestry across geography. A wide-scale analysis of 356 individuals from 22 locations found that Khoisan ancestry predominated in 14 of them. Inland regions showed higher Khoisan ancestry. Eastern regions carried more Bantu speaker and West African ancestry. And the western coastal areas around Cape Town, the very heartland of the Cape Malay community, showed increased Asian ancestry. The geography of the sea route left its fingerprint on the geography of DNA. The same studies confirmed the pattern seen at the individual level: male-biased admixture from East Africans and Europeans, and female-biased admixture from Khoisan populations, supported by both mitochondrial and Y chromosome data. The population is described, plainly and respectfully, as descendants of local Khoisan and Bantu-speaking peoples, European settlers, and enslaved individuals from Africa and Asia. Every one of those ancestries is real. Everyone is documented. And it is important to say clearly what this science does not do. It does not rank peoples, and it does not measure worth. It simply records how a community came to be. What it records is not a mystery to be solved. It is a history to be honored. Part 6. A Living Heritage. The genetic mosaic of the Cape Malay community is often presented as something astonishing, even unexplained. But it is not unexplained. It is precisely, painfully documented by the records of Dutch East India Company slavery, by the exile of men like Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, and by peer-reviewed genetics that align with that history rather than overturning it. The unbalanced contributions, the maternal Khoisan majority, the Asian paternal lines, the East African and Bantu speaker ancestry, each of these traces back to a real, knowable event in the story of forced migration to the Cape between 1652 and 1834. What the DNA ultimately tells us is not about difference, but about endurance. Out of one of the cruelest systems in human history, slavery, exile, and captivity drawn from half the planet, a durable culture took root on the slopes above Cape Town. The people brought here in chains did not simply survive. They built a community, a faith, a heritage that still stands and still remembers. Their bodies carry the archive of 3 continents, and their story asks something of everyone who hears it, to see, in that mixed inheritance, not a curiosity, but the proof of lives that refuse to be erased. This film touches on the history of slavery, exile, and forced migration. If this material is distressing, please reach out to a local mental health service or a trusted community or heritage organization for support.